Wildfire is an essential component of most forest ecosystems. We recognize now that it's really important to the health and origins of most of our forest stands. And so it doesn't matter if we're talking about the west side forests of the Cascades or east side ponderosa pine or lodgepole pine forest common in the Intermountain West. All of these forests tend to have a history of fire, but the nature of that history of fire can be really variable, and the nature of humans' interaction with those wildfires can be, with those fires can be really variable. Additionally, human presence on the landscape has changed through time. Human habitation on the landscape has changed through time. Human ignition patterns of fires have changed through time. And humans have changed the climate, which is altering fire history through time. So we need to take a multifaceted approach to understanding wildfire. We need an approach that understands that all forests are different, that fires are different, and that patterns of human habitation and interaction with these fires has also changed through time. And the mosaic of those interactions result in the scenarios we see today, which sometimes involve tremendous wildfires, what we call megafires on the landscape. Some would say we've entered an era of megafires, especially in the Pacific Northwest. Imagery from fires can be especially dramatic, and you've seen this especially after a summer of really intense wildfires. You see these dramatic images with orange light and giant flames. This image probably immediately connotes to you the danger of wildfire. However, I'm just going to note that looking in this photo, although immediately you might think of wildfires, notice that all of our trees are still green here. We have tremendously dark light and a lot of smoke showing wildfire, but we have a lot of green trees. And so this pattern is gonna stay with us as we examine some big wildfires. Wildfires can seem more dramatic to us than they can be sometimes to ecosystems. So we're going to differentiate between wildfire intensity, that is the amount of energy that is released in the process of the burn, and wildfire severity, that is the ecological consequences of the burn. In the Pacific Northwest, a lot of our attitudes towards fire are influenced by some severe fires, and I do mean severe in terms of their ecological severity, that we have seen early in European history or earlier in European history in the Pacific Northwest. This informs a lot of our management approaches to wildfire. Most notably, our approaches to wildfire were really shaped by the 1910 fires at the Big Burn in northern Idaho and western Montana. In Oregon and Washington, a lot of our attitudes towards wildfire are also influenced by a series of burns that took place in the Tillamook National Forest and State Forest. This is a photo of the Tillamook burn from 1933. This is an Oregonian file photo. This was a large fire. This fire was 239,000 acres. It was thought to be caused by logging activities and burned through parts of Tillamook, Washington, and Yamhill counties in Oregon. Then the area burned again. Here's 1939. We're only a few years later, well, 6 years later. And 6 years later, here again, we have another logging caused fire in basically the same area. Again, burning almost 200,000 acres. And most of it that had just burned 6 years earlier. And then an additional 30,000 acres of new area. So this is dramatic. And then again, we come back only another 6 years later, and then we get another giant burn. This one again, almost 200,000 acres. And it's thought that this was again caused by humans. And so this is a really dramatic series of burns, and it's really important to recognize because some of the fire history we're going to talk about after this involves us thinking of Pacific Northwest fires, and especially west of the Cascades, as fires that are stand replacing like this. They're dramatic, they're large burns, but we tend to think that they come back on large fire return intervals. And the Tillamook burns really challenge that. Regardless, this cemented a very strong anti-fire uh, perception among professionals in forestry. And some of that is warranted, and some of that may have caused problems, particularly on the east side with forest management. Here's another big fire that influenced the way we think about our history of fires and the potential severity of fires in the Pacific Northwest. Here's the Yalcott burn, again, almost 200,000 acres. These are giant fires. The cause of this was initially thought to be land clearing. You can see that this was a severe fire in that in this photo, you can see widespread tree mortality. And it's not very patchy. It doesn't appear very patchy in this photo. It seems uniformly disastrous. So this is south of Mount St. Helens and Mount Adams. Here's another burn, or the same burn, just another photo of the same burn. And you can see here a really severe pattern of burning, and note that you can see an individual in the middle of the photo, well, the bottom, let's see, right middle of the photo here, outside the tent, you can see an individual, which gives you a sense for how large these trees were that burned. So we're talking about old growth forests here that burned. And then again here, a group of individuals out replanting in this burn area following the burn. And so there were a series of replanting efforts that were intensive to try to bring this area back into forests as fast as possible. So let's talk about why we have fires. Fire is an integral part of nearly all forest landscapes, like we talked about, but it takes place on different scales. So we say that there are high frequency, low intensity fires. And so these are fires that don't release much energy from the system when they come through, but they come through with a high frequency. And so in a system like a ponderosa pine forest with a grass understory, we'll talk about that. That's a high frequency, low intensity fire. On the flip side, on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have low frequency, high intensity fires, fires that don't occur very often, but when they do, they release a lot of energy. And even on the west side, we have a tendency to think that we can think of a dry forest and wet forest dichotomy, and that will categorize all fires. Well, it's important to know that even near Olympia, Washington, for example, even in the Olympic Mountains, there's not one type of fire. And so depending on the conditions, the winds, the time of year, we can get mosaic pattern, low intensity fires or high intensity fires. Our stand replacing fires tend to be associated with dry conditions and hot east winds on the west side of the Cascades. A normal every year pattern in fire can be a mosaic pattern, small footprint fires that are low intensity fires that can occur anytime and might be patchy. And so we're going to see the interaction of those two types of fires even on the west side. Often when we're learning about fire, we have to learn about something called the fire triangle. So the fire triangle generally involves what are the things that you need for fire to happen. You need fuel, you need oxygen, and often, obviously you need an ignition source or heat. And that triad produces a fire. But in fire behavior, we think of the fire behavior triangle. And so, of course, you need ignition, but you need a combination of weather, topography, and fuel in order to predict where a fire is going to go and how it's going to move. So fires tend to move up slope rather than down slope, or at least they move faster going uphill. Depending on the nature of the fuel, whether the fuel is fine fuel or large fuel, we can have different types of fire. The arrangement of that fuel obviously matters. If you've ever built a campfire, you know that. And the moisture level. So larger material tends to not burn as well because it tends to have a higher moisture level unless you've had a large period of dry conditions or weather that has resulted in the drying out of that large material. So wind, temperature, humidity, and precipitation, those all govern the other component of our fire behavior triangle, right? So what weather are we talking about? Well, of course, relative humidity and precipitation matter. But interestingly, if you have a season with a wet spring, that can lead to really large fires later in the season, as I saw in 1910 in the Big Burn fires. Wet conditions early in the spring led to rapid growth of understory vegetation and grasses in northern Idaho and western Montana. That resulted in a lot of fine fuel buildup, and then temperatures dried out, or temperatures became very hot later in the summer. Relative humidity and precipitation dropped. You had all this fine fuel that it was really easy for it to catch fire. And then, of course, winds, and especially on the west side of the Cascades, this is a major factor because when we get east winds, winds that come from the east over to the west side, that can be really dry air that our forests and systems aren't used to seeing. That really dry air can further dry out ground fuels really quickly and lead to the spread of fire both downhill uh, and because of winds can be strong, winds can dictate the direction of that fire. So it could be downhill, it could be from east to west, it could be all sorts of directions that you wouldn't predict just based on topography and fuels. Okay, so then of course, this leads us to talking about a further triad of terms that we need to think about, differences in wildfire types. And so all of those fire triangle and fire behavior triangle components lead to different types of fire. Ground fires, smoldering fires that just move through the duff, slowly progressing. And these can be very slow progressing fires, but they can be very important in terms of damaging roots and underground structures. Surface fires tend to be rapid. They tend to move quickly through stands. They tend to release small amounts of energy, so these tend to be low intensity fires. And if you're restoring fire to an ecosystem, often we're trying to focus on surface fires, on restoring surface fires, rather than crown fires. And crown fires, of course, this is the Bambi movie version of fire destroying the entire forest. The idea of a crown fire is that this fire has gotten into the upper parts of the tree canopy and can spread rapidly. These tend to be high intensity fire patterns. Let's see, what else do I want to say? Surface fires burn fine above ground organic materials such as leaves, grasses, herbaceous plants, and they can also thin out seedlings, which is really important. I think that's good. That's all we need to say. Okay. It's important to note that after fires, especially severe fires, in any forest, and this is just a small list, looks like with a typo on hardwoods. There's just a small list here, but after any fire, there's going to be a segment of species that do really well, ecologically responding to that, sometimes fire adapted, and there'll be other species that don't do as well. That dictates the nature of succession in our forests. It dictates who's present. So for example, a large number of Douglas fir in our northwestern west side forests can be traced to a history of severe fires, especially during the medieval warm period, that may have been present in the Pacific Northwest, opened up a lot of stands and made it possible for Douglas fir to do very well in open stand conditions. A species like Pinus contorta, or lodgepole pine, is actually dependent on large fires in order to open its serotinous cones, release the seeds, and regenerate. So here's another species that does really well on fire. Not only is it fire adapted, we might say it's fire dependent in that regeneration does better in the presence of fire. We have species like Pinus ponderosa that grow really well in the open. Hardwood species, we've seen even on Evergreen's campus, we've had small fires that lead to opening up the understory in a way that we see these banner years for maple reproduction, for bigleaf maple reproduction in the understory. Is that a coincidence? Maybe maple was adapted to these small fire events. And then we have other shrub species that can do really well. What we've just talked about are the basics of wildfire and thinking about wildfire in any scenario. What we need to do next is talk about how fires differ in different types of systems. And so we'll start with talking about the East Side fires and the kind of dogma that is driving our perception of fuels treatments and fire behavior in the Western United States. But a lot of this is driven by dry fire systems, systems that have low intensity, high frequency fire regimes, like the Ponderosa pine. So shown on the screen here is an example from one paper that is among uh, over 100 papers, many more than that, in the southwestern United States on Ponderosa pine fire ecology. So we'll come back to that in the next video.